Welcome everyone as you are joining the meeting. Welcome to this Lemons Legacies Porch Talk, Beyond the Altar, Unlearning the Black Church Model on Mental Health. My name is Sarah Thomas. I'm the Associate Director of the Lemon Project, and I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. We're continuing to explore the theme of the 14th Annual Lemon Project Spring Symposium, which is taking our time, healing through Black history, family, and communities. Before we begin, I have two statements to read and a content notice to provide. First, the land acknowledgement. William Mary acknowledges the Indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today, the Cherenhaka, Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Patawamek, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respects to their tribal members past and present. Next, the statement on slavery and its legacies. The Board of Visitors acknowledges that William Mary enslaved people, exploited them and their labor, and perpetuated the legacies of racial discrimination. The board profoundly regrets these activities, apologizes for them, expresses its deep appreciation for the contributions made by the African and African American members of its community to the vitality of William and Mary, then, now, and for all time coming, and commits to continue our efforts to remedy the lingering effects of past injustices. Next, before we proceed, we'd also like to issue a content warning. The following discussion will touch on mental health issues and their impacts. We understand these topics can be sensitive and encourage everyone to prioritize their own well-being and seek support if necessary. And now I'd like to introduce Arielle Neblett, the moderator of this panel. She's an Emmy-nominated video director and producer and graduate of Virginia State University. She's a natural-born creative with a passion for telling stories, specifically stories of the Black experience. The Black experience isn't all pain and is certainly not only making songs and viral dances for the world's entertainment. It's the in-between, mundanity, and gray areas she wants to highlight most. As an Afro Caribbean raised in Brooklyn, New York, Arielle understands the beauty and complexities and both the similarities and differences of being Black, and more so, what we stand to learn from each other. She is active in her community and a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Arielle?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Arielle Neblett, moderator of today's discussion. And I'm joined today by Dr. Brandy Lee, who holds a doctorate of philosophy and psychology, Dr. Tamra Diaz, who holds a doctorate in higher education leadership with a focus on K-12 education, nonprofit, and corporate leadership development, and Dr. Latasha Ely Kelly, who holds a doctorate in philosophy and language, literacy, and culture. She's also a professor at George Mason University and University of Maryland Global Campus, and is the owner and principal consultant for the Millennial Black Professor, LLC. Thank you all for joining us. And now I'm going to start the discussion today off with Dr. Lee. I know today's topic was your brainchild, which then led you to do a study with Dr. Ely Kelly. Can you tell me why this topic was so important to you and why you wanted to bring it to a bigger discussion?
Absolutely, and thank you, Arielle. The answer to the question of why this study was so important is one that is both simple and complex. The simple part of that answer is that for Black men and women in America, there has not been the space, the safety, or the language available that could help us form the questions, much less receive answers to those questions as it related to successfully navigating the situations that have impacted our mental health. The complex portion of that answer is that our lived experiences, even in 2024, are so very deeply rooted in the legacy of slavery and our connection to the Black church. Black men and women have historically relied on religion as an end-all be-all solution to our problems, which in all honesty has set many of us back further from a mental health perspective. Further, when we engage in the peeling back of the many layers of trauma that Black men and women experience, we will find that while rooted in an ancestry that is on the one hand very rich, it is on the other hand deeply impacted by the historical atrocities associated with slavery. This includes seeing our loved ones tortured and killed, our families being broken apart, being the subject of scientific experiments, and never getting the 40 acres and the mules. Absolutely, those things still impact us today. In many ways, the Black experience has continued to be a vicious cycle derived from slavery and supported by age-old protective factors such as what happens in this house stays in this house, or better yet, let us pray about it. Then we experienced COVID, and we saw our lives unfolding on screens right in the palms of our hands and in our very living rooms. And we realized that we were all struggling, and it was becoming harder and harder to stay quiet about it. So the need for mental health support then became more obvious, and as such, more acceptable. Social media not only allowed us to see firsthand the social injustices happening across our country, but social media also played an integral role in being a tool for mental health support. We started to learn the words that gave us the overall language for describing our experiences, and many of us, myself included, felt heard. Social media provided the language that would help Black men and women describe their experiences, which in turn helped Black men and women form the questions to be able to get the answers we were still so desperately seeking after attending Sunday church service. Social media allowed for the amplification of Black voices in a realm that had traditionally been heavily influenced by white norms of mental health care. And so in the study that Dr. Ely Kelly and I conducted, we sought to understand more about Black experiences with social media and mental health, and to learn more about the barriers to Black mental health support and access, as the tides were certainly changing.
Thank you for that intro, Dr. Lee. And so I'm going to jump in and cover more of the specifics of the study. But before we go into the findings, I do want to provide some background on the demographics. So our goal was 30 participants in this qualitative study, and we reached 29. Participants ranged in age between 18 through 24, and then over 55, with the majority being 25 to 44. All but one participant identified as a woman, and all participants identified as Black or African American. Around 80% had earned a bachelor's degree or higher. The group was almost split down the middle on marital status, with half being single, half married, and then almost 90% are employed, and socioeconomic status varied significantly. The majority of participants reside on the East Coast, but there were some in the Midwest, in the South, in the West. So of course the data presented is not generalizable, but the demographic disparity across participants outside of identifying as Black is something to note in terms of recognizing that mental health concerns and the importance of addressing them, it does not rest with any one group or pocket of individuals within the Black community. And so almost 50% of participants strongly agreed that mental health is an issue within the Black community. 72% said they've experienced mental health issues, and these were described as varying levels of depression and anxiety, both doctor and self-diagnosed, ADHD, PTSD, general feelings of overwhelm, lack of rest, childhood trauma, and attempts at taking one's own life. When asked about their beliefs around seeking mental health support, all but one participant communicated positive indications around doing so. But several of those who spoke in favor of it noted, despite believing this support is needed, multiple barriers to access exist, from financial constraints, insurance limitations, and lingering community and familial stigma, to difficulty navigating medical systems, the absence of quality mental health professionals, and specifically Black therapists or Black therapists who are able to participate in the health insurance system in a way that makes them available to Black clients, or Black therapists who aren't burnt out themselves and aren't, in an effort to protect their own mental health, not taking on new clients. There's also inadequacy and failure on the part of non-Black providers to believe Black clients. And even from their trained medical perspective, there's that tendency to default to seeing Black clients as superhuman. There's the lack of resources that speak specifically to the Black experience. Even knowing where to begin to find a provider is an issue, and then finding the right fit. So as Dr. Lee explained, our initial focus with this work was investigating social media as a source of mental health support for Black people. And this could be through dedicated theme pages, professional pages of licensed therapists, counselors, social workers, and other qualified professionals in the field. There's also coaches and consultants who may or may not be professionally licensed, but they offer support around mental wellness. And then other individuals who simply are offering their perspective and lived experiences. So our questions focused on participants' interactions with social media in this capacity. In unpacking the responses to those questions, including whether and how participants engaged with mental health content on social media, the impact of that engagement on general knowledge around mental health, external conversations about it, and then subsequent outreach for additional help, and what more they would like to see about mental health support on social media. The multiple conversations Dr. Lee and I had as we processed what was shared is what ultimately led us to this panel. And so what came up in the participant in our own experiences was trauma around being told to keep things in-house, being told to just pray about it, seeking help within the church only to be shunned for it or to be treated by unlicensed individuals who haven't begun to unpack their own trauma and beliefs that are rooted in patriarchal, misogynistic ideology, and being conditioned that being a quote unquote good Christian means sucking it up, and that asking for help means your faith is lacking. And so we know that African Americans report higher rates of religiosity and use of religious coping strategies compared to other ethnic groups. And based on CDC data presented by the U.S. Office of Minority Health, African Americans reportedly have a greater severity of untreated mental health disorders than any other known racial group. So there's clearly a disconnect, and that's what we wanted to explore. Amongst a host of other reasons rooted in historical context and structural and systemic racism, part of that disconnect is what we refer to as religious grooming. And while the term is typically reserved for sexual references, grooming at its core is defined as the practice of preparing or training someone for a particular purpose or activity. And so we argue that this is part of the Black church model on mental health. This grooming toward what happens in the house or in our community or in the church stays there, or having no boundaries and ignoring boundaries, viewing acts of self-preservation as selfish, which then leads to guilt and shame when someone goes against the grain and chooses themselves. And this is a challenge in almost every aspect of our lives, including the workplace. So Dr. Diaz is going to take us further into the conversation by sharing more on how we experience this in corporate and other professional spaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro and that transition. And so as Dr. Ely Kelly already mentioned, we see some of these same themes specifically in professional environments with Black men and women professionals at all levels. And so I have over a decade of experience leading teams personally, and then of course acting as a consultant to higher education organizations, nonprofit and corporate entities, and specifically around challenges they're facing in terms of employee turnover, retention, or even just in terms of feedback that they've gotten about the workplace being unsafe. And so typically we see the usual challenges that people may think about, climbing the career ladder, trying to ascend in an organization, maybe that you started at the entry level, and now you're trying to move into management or even senior leadership. But with Black men and women, we also see challenges in terms of navigating spaces that typically are not equipped to recognize or even address the specific challenges and the mental health needs that arise from systemic racism and sexism, which are all, apparent in many professional work environments. And as already mentioned, the lack of access to culturally competent mental health care just exacerbates the problem even more. And so Black professionals are forced to bear these burdens in silence and a lot of times in isolation. And of course, this just leads to burnout. I've seen a lot of professionals and a lot of leaders push themselves beyond burnout around the idea that they have to show up and do a lot. And so in seeking solace and support, many people turn to the church. They turn to the church because it's safe. It's an environment that's familiar to them. It's one that they know. Unfortunately, we typically will see that this environment does the exact opposite. In the Black community, the church is typically where we go when we have a problem or when we have a concern. And so the church has an opportunity here to support rather than kind of further alienate individuals who are struggling. And the experiences of Black men and women in the church regarding their mental health reflect a bigger issue here. It shows the gap between communal support, which we get from community in the church, but also the acknowledgement of individual mental health needs. So the idea that we can both exist in community, but also still have our own struggles on a more individual basis. And the church, because it has such a significant influence, has so much potential to stand next to people, be an ally, and provide support. But unfortunately, a lot of times we see them further exacerbate the mental health challenges and reinforce some of the same stigmas that a lot of professionals struggle with in the workplace. So as we move forward today, we'll consider the ways that systemic barriers, lack of access to mental health resources, and overall just the complex role of the church in dealing with challenges like this. And so our goal, of course, is not to just highlight the challenges and tell you about them, but hopefully also explore pathways forward to be able to create a solution.
Thank you all for that background and debriefing the study for the framework of today's conversation. Dr. Lee, you did touch on this, but as far as the legacy of slavery, we know that depending on your age and what region you're from, we're really not that far removed from slavery, 3 to 5 generations for some. What can you tell us how this ties back into the legacy of slavery and how this impacts us today?
Sure. So in the article, Black People's Spirituality and Mental Health, our authors Penderson and Penderson help us to appreciate two things that are so critical for today's discussion and for unpacking that question, Arielle. The first being the impact of slavery on Black mental health. The second being the way religiosity impacts delayed help seeking in the Black community. The authors shared that Black men and women who wanted to escape slavery were considered to be mentally ill. So in other words, if you had the wherewithal to know that you did not want to be enslaved and you did not want to be oppressed, then what was said is that something was wrong with you. Ultimately, whether one escaped slavery or not, or even if you never physically experienced slavery, the impact of slavery has been long felt, with Black men being considered angry if they express anything beyond contentment, and Black women feeling compelled to live out the role of the strong Black woman trope. Neither have been helpful for us as a community, but we had religion and we could go to church. Church became a safe place for Black people, not only for worshiping God, but from escaping the reality of our experiences as enslaved people. The church provided hope for some type of freedom, even if that freedom couldn't be achieved during our earthly lives. Church and religiosity have allowed us to believe that if we have faith, if we pray, if we are long-suffering, and if we live according to the scriptures, then we will conquer all that troubles us. We have even been told that if in the event we don't conquer certain things, then our experiences are still a part of God's greater plan. Again, a legacy of slavery. Have these things helped us cope? Somewhat, I think. I know personally the power of a praying grandmother, so I don't at all deny the power or the benefit of prayer in some of these coping strategies. But I would argue that there is a disservice in pseudo or partially effective coping mechanisms, as even with them, Black men and women are still suffering. Black women have high experiences of church attendance, but we also have high levels of chronic health conditions and greatly delayed responses for seeking help. We even have a saying in the church community that we are too blessed to be stressed, right? But the truth is we are stressed. We are tired. We are exhausted. We are drowning in the maintenance of the strong Black woman trope, or working really hard to not appear to be the angry Black man. The traditional church model has provided only minimal support for helping us dismantle those ideologies, or for providing mental health support as we navigate our lived experiences as women, as daughters born to women who needed the same support, as sisters who walked on eggshells in homes as to not be upsetting to others, as wives who are in marriages with men who have been impacted by the legacies of slavery in their own ways, and as mothers who are yearning for tools to help impact a different outcome for their own children. Speaking still from the lens of a Black woman, we have gone physically from a time of not having the option to not carry all the weight to now not knowing how to discard the weight of the world that is on our shoulders. And then the rest of the world applauds us for our strength. Sometimes we fall short though, and sometimes we are not able to do it all. And so this pressure associated with our perceived failure then leaves us feeling guilty. It has left us feeling as if we have missed the mark and are in some way weak. Again, the legacy of slavery, and that historically weakness has not been an option for us. In attempting to get out of that space, we've now found ourselves in the soft girl era, right? Soft life era. But even now, many of us don't know how to fully embrace what it means to live a soft life because we do not know what it means not to have to be the strong Black woman. Rest and relaxation, peace and mental health, those things feel like a treat that we as Black women do not deserve to partake in. They are foreign to us. So it escapes our mind that we could be the recipients of all of these good things. And keep in mind, Arielle, when I say soft life, I am not saying that you have to spend lots of money or that lots of money has to be spent on you. But at the very least, it should mean that you are intentional about rest and the prioritization of your mental health, if nothing more. And so our struggle to accept these things and to prioritize ourselves, it is undoubtedly one of the legacies of slavery. And so I'm glad to be here today and to be part of the conversation and to challenge others to think about Black mental health in this way and to consider what some next steps are.
Thank you so much. That was so beautifully and eloquently put. Something that you said that stood out to me, too blessed to be stressed. That's what falls under the term of toxic positivity. And it's a way of like skewing reality. You know, sometimes when you talk about your problems, so somebody else out there has it worse, if there are other people that are hungry. How does things like too blessed to be stressed and leading us to also overwork ourselves? You know, a lot of us have heard from our parents, we have to work twice as hard than our white counterparts to achieve half as much, which leads then to toxic productivity. So how does toxic positivity and toxic productivity play a role in this conversation?
That is another great question, Arielle, and I can definitely tackle the toxic positivity aspect. So first, what do we mean by toxic positivity, right? Particularly in arguing that it's one component of this Black church model on mental health. So on a basic level, toxic positivity overemphasizes the importance of maintaining a positive outlook. This ultimately dismisses our genuine human emotional experiences and stifles honest discussions about mental health and other critical conversations within the Black community. It manifests in cultural and church narratives that prioritize strength and resilience to the point of invalidating feelings of vulnerability or the need for help, and more specifically asking for help outside of prayer or answering altar calls and simply taking it to the Lord. Now, don't get it twisted, okay? I love God. God is good and prayer works and positivity has its place. But this overwhelming glorification of long suffering within the Black church and community, and particularly the long suffering of Black women, it often prevents us from seeking appropriate support. And this failure to do so can then just contribute to the cycle and perpetuation of the long-held stigma associated with mental health, illness, and wellness. And so when we talk about solutions and what's next, which I know we're going to get into more shortly, but this is part of it, a transformative discussion, like Dr. Lee said, on mental and emotional health must challenge the narrative of toxic positivity and long suffering and promote a more nuanced understanding of fortitude that includes the power and courage in seeking help to address our holistic, emotional, and psychological needs. Unfortunately, we've been conditioned that wanting more for ourselves, even for our health and well-being, is selfish or even prideful, that establishing and maintaining boundaries is disrespectful, and that seeking help is doing too much. And we kind of saw this play out in response to Risa Tisa's 50+ part TikTok story about who she married. Some of y'all might be familiar with it. But regardless of your thoughts on the story, her motives, the things that she received in the aftermath, a very high-level cursory content analysis of the comments and feedback she received yields at least two things. One being her desire to fulfill societal expectations for womanhood based on proximity to a man and marriage, and the other being her willingness to accept piss-poor behavior and turn a blind eye to it to maintain that status. So I recently also watched another Black woman who's a social media influencer, her video about her husband's failure and inability to show up for her throughout their over decade-long marriage, and how she held this information in to shield him from any negative perception. But the last straw was when his absence and lack of effort extended to after the death of their son, when she was forced to basically exist and show up as a single parent throughout the son's recovery from a drowning incident, and to, in the end, show up on her own in his final moments of life. And then within a matter of days, the husband had the nerve to be tapping her on her shoulder in bed. But for calling this wholly inadequate behavior out, the woman was dragged for not protecting the sanctity of marriage and for disrespecting her husband publicly. She talked about how the world has romanticized marriages and stripped the people in them of their humanity. And she said, because marriage is rooted in holiness, we let the church take the Bible and train wives into submission. And then she said that throughout her marriage, she heard so many scriptures quoted on pulpits to try to shut her up and sit her down. And so that made me think of Melissa Harris Perry's book, Sister Citizen. And in there, she says, or she asks the question, is there truly a balm in Gilead for African-American women? And so Black women make up 2/3 of Black church membership. And as Perry says, faith in a benevolent and loving God is a common tool Black women employ to straighten out the crooked room of race and gender stereotypes. But those stereotypes are often upheld within what is supposed to be this sacred space that is the Black church, because upholding them allows for a status quo and power dynamic that privileges Black men to persist. So in all honesty, I don't have an answer for whether there's truly a balm in Gilead for all Black church folk. And that's because when we talk about Black liberation, it has to be inclusive. And in this case, regardless of gender, which is problematic within an institution that in its own ways is rooted in patriarchy, that relegates Black women to certain roles, to silence, and to other behaviors that render her, again, as a good Christian woman. Perry goes on to say, the church has traditionally been the primary site for assistance in Black communities, with Black women leading the charge on various outreach efforts. But even as they give help, she says, Black women may feel discouraged from revealing the depths of their own needs. The strong Black woman is denied her sadness. Because she must serve, she cannot be broken. But Black women do experience sadness and are perhaps uniquely vulnerable to it. And so this is also part of that Black church model that we must interrogate and disrupt, especially considering Perry's assertion that well-meaning religious communities can often convey to women that suffering and pain and loss are somehow God's will, right? Which Black women then often internalize as suffering being something that we deserve or that will earn us favor with God if and only if we endure it silently and without complaining. And so at the end of the day, not only is the day going to end, but as the woman who lost her son said, it's silly to think that you can be a lifeboat for someone else while you're drowning. But with the rise of toxic positivity, that's exactly what we've been conditioned to do.
Thank you. And Dr. Diaz, can you talk to the the portion on toxic productivity as you see that in the workplace working with leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. So building on this idea that Black men and women have to work twice as hard to be half as good as their counterparts, productivity becomes toxic when there's a continued pressure to be productive at all times and prioritize your work demands, your to-do list over your own mental health and your own personal needs. And so, on one hand, we already know that this usually can stem from systemic pressures where people are feeling like they have to prove themselves, to prove their worth. You have to prove that you're valuable to your employer or the places that you serve. I also see this a lot because I work with a lot of higher education organizations and nonprofits and educators in K through 12, where the burden is even heavier because people tell them that because they're doing what is considered mission work or service work or work for the community, that they just kind of have to suffer through the challenges and deal with it. Saying things like, you're helping kids, so, it's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be difficult. Or you didn't go into this, for the ease or for you went into it because you had the good heart, or, you really were passionate about what you're doing, which then makes people feel guilty when they are struggling or when they do feel like they're overworking. A lot of places, we see people struggling with leaving work at work. They take it home. They're thinking about work when they're at home. They're checking emails at 3 o'clock in the morning. And all they can do is kind of focus on how they're showing up and how they're furthering this mission of proving that they're valuable by working harder. And so it's specifically harmful in places where Black men and women professionals are in leadership roles, especially if they are the only one or just one of a few, because they're forced to burn out even more because they feel like they're representing an entire race. Maybe they're the first Black man who's been in an executive role, and so they can't slow down because everybody's looking to them to prove why they were, promoted in the first place or got the title. Or maybe they're the first Black woman to supervise the team, and so they can't say, this is too much, I'm working too much and I need a break because I'm a Black woman. I should just be grateful that I've been given the opportunity. And so, unfortunately, we see these mental health needs just continually pushed aside, all for the focus on whatever the company wants or whatever the organization needs at the time. And within this, I've also had, the time to sit down with leaders, consult with them, consult with leadership teams and organizations around this conversation of, well, how do we not create a space where toxic productivity pops up? And I always say, you can always tell what's going on by looking at the culture in an organization. I remember my own experience where I worked in a place that seemingly, was great for we worked with kids. Our mission was service, but at the end of a semester, employees would be praised based on how few sick days they took. So leadership would stand up and announce, so-and-so only took 1 day. Congratulations to them for being here every single day this semester and not taking time off. I also worked in a corporate environment where we had unlimited PTO. And so there was a requirement that you took, a minimum, I think, of 10 PTO days per quarter, which sounded fabulous at the beginning. But quickly we realized that when we went to take PTO, the week or two before, our calendar would get filled with all these extra meetings. We'd get random projects and tasks assigned to us. And when employees kind of raised their hands and said, this is pushing us to not want to take PTO, it was just said, well, you just have to deal with it because you're going to be out for a week and a half. This is just what's normal. You should expect to work hard before you go on PTO, which then, of course, makes nobody want to take PTO. It's like, why would I take time off if I have to stress myself out just to be able to leave the office? And so I think about this idea of toxic productivity. I always say that it starts with the leadership down. How are the top people who are in charge of making decisions not only saying we have this as a policy, but are you actually building a culture within your organization that encourages people to take care of themselves and prioritize mental health? Or do you just have kind of policies that are standard or that exist, but all of your actions on a day-to-day basis further perpetuate the mental health challenges for Black men and women in professional spaces?
Thank you. That PTO discussion is so relatable. I love that our generation has been pushing back on that. I know there's a time where my grandmother would be like, you're always taking off. And I'm like, yes, because it's a benefit. Like, it's just like my health insurance. I'm taking my PTO days because it's a part of my benefit package. But I also recently just saw on LinkedIn that a recruiter stated he calls candidates at 11 p.m. or on the weekends or early morning, just to kind of test their loyalty of how they would work for the company, if they would be willing to work late hours and on their free time. And of course, rightfully, he was dragged to filth. But it also is something that, for me, who really is intentional about my personal time and my personal care, if that were to happen to me for a recruiter, I would be like, that's not a company I want to work for, because they don't respect my time already before I'm not employed. So you, as someone that works with leadership, how can you make sure that they implement or advise them to implement these incentives to make sure that their employees are working, with a life-work balance?
Yeah, so if that recruiter called me, I wouldn't get a call back, because I would not be answering that phone. I'd just lose out on that job opportunity. And I think about that because that's of course not the only instance, right? I gave a couple of my own examples. You gave the recruiter example. And I'm sure if we were to put up a post on LinkedIn and just ask people, like, share about a time where your employer did something that directly impacted your mental health, either through policy or practice, you would probably have a post with thousands upon thousands of comments and shares, because unfortunately, we all can name something similar to this that has happened to us, especially for Black men and women in professional spaces. And so a lot of leadership will typically come to me because, as we know, most professional spaces tend to not be very proactive. So by the time a lot of my clients come to me, they've already had an issue. Somebody has already quit. The post has already gone up and they're being dragged on social media, like something has happened. And now they're like, we need to go back and fix it. We just need to make sure everything's all right. And so I always try to say, before we got to this point, how much were you listening to the feedback that was being given to you? So a lot of places will send out surveys. They'll collect the data because it looks really cute to say, we do an employee engagement survey twice a year. We want to hear from you. We want to, they want to put your face on the human resources page. They want to make it seem like they're listening, when in actuality, they take this data and the data just sits. Nothing comes from it, or you don't even hear about it. Like, you do the survey and then the survey evaporates. And you're just wondering what happened to that survey that took me 15 minutes to fill out. I gave you the feedback. Nobody ever followed up. And so many things get lost without the follow-up and the follow-through on what you set out to do. So I always encourage people, go back to the data you already have. What were people telling you that you were ignoring? And what were you doing when you had the opportunity to make change? Like, why didn't you take action? Why did you ignore them? Because the first step to actually making change is acknowledging that you messed up along the way and that you didn't handle it the right way, right way the first time. And then I also say accountability. I've had tons of experience in the nonprofit space as CEO personally, and then also coached executives in the nonprofit space. And nonprofits report leadership, they report to a board. And so you typically have anywhere from 7 to 15 people evaluating how well you are doing your job. Now, most corporate boards also may do some stretch of this, but they tend to be a little bit more hands-off, especially for larger organizations. They're looking at profit and sales. Nobody is really holding a lot of leadership accountable for, if people don't want to work here, you're not going to get paid, or we're going to let you go and find somebody else who can come in and create a safe work environment. And so without that accountability, a lot of leaders are just kind of given free range to create and perpetuate unsafe work environments that further create mental health challenges. So I always say, check your data and ensure you have people around you who are going to hold you accountable when you're not doing what you need to do and are going to have those difficult conversations with you.
Thank you. And that's also why diversity on a board or a leadership panel is important. So everyone is not thinking the same. Like, we all need to be working,
right?
But they're on the golf course. So can you tell me, Dr. Arielle Kelly, if someone is viewing this right now and they would love to implement some of these practices into their church and their ministry, how can they do that to make sure they're actionable items as well as access for those seeking help?
Well, thanks for that question, Arielle. It automatically makes me think of my home church, Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, where Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley serves as pastor. And he's been very proactive and intentional in the ways he's ensured mental, emotional, and psychological well-being are valued, promoted, and supported throughout the entire church. So as far back as I can remember, he's always been vocal and open about being in therapy himself. But when he announced that he was taking a sabbatical in 2019 to focus on his mental health even more, just to be restored, and especially in light of the deaths of several of his pastoral brothers, that was a game changer, because him talking about being in therapy as a member, you could brush that away. It could be in one ear, out the other, but the sabbatical was big. He did end up having to come back like 2 or 3 weeks early because of COVID, but he talked about how impactful it was for him to have that concentrated time off prior to the pandemic, because he otherwise might not have had the capacity to support the congregation in the way he did. And then from there, I just recall the church bringing on more staff to build out the well-being ministries with licensed professionals, licensed being the key. So not the couple who's been in a toxic 25-year marriage serving as leads for the marriage ministry, okay? But I emphasize Pastor Wesley's actions because a 2015 study on Black pastors' mental health, coping, and health seeking in the Journal of Counseling and Values indicated that African-American pastors often are the first line of defense for church members' mental health needs. And so I was interested in similar models at other churches, and they do exist. Hayes asserted in her article in the same journal that there is limited evidence regarding the effectiveness of church-based interventions and the capacity of Black churches to tackle mental health issues. So I kind of went down this rabbit hole and found a study that looked at mental health beliefs and practices and behavior specific to the Black church. And this was in the Journal of Social Work and Christianity. And what they found was that in light of distrust for clinicians who often don't look like us and don't or won't extend understanding and empathy, participants overwhelmingly believe that the Black church is uniquely positioned to offer care that transcends those cultural and social barriers because there's an innate understanding. But in the instances where we see that happening, where the Black church is transcending those barriers and being of service in that way, there are some specific strategies that make for more solid, lasting church-based efforts and even collaborations between the church and clinicians. And so some of those practices include, one, ensuring that counseling professionals possess and are invested in developing congregation-specific cultural competence to best meet member needs and not trying to use a one-size-fits-all approach. And so this means taking the time to learn and understand and demonstrate the norms for that specific church, just showing reverence for the Lord and church and general respect for the pastor, church leadership, and the membership. And then, as Dr. Diaz shared, assessment and research is also key. So collecting data, not just on member demographics, but on what they've expressed as needs and ideas and suggestions, and making sure that you're doing so in a culturally sensitive manner. So you're not objectifying the membership. Of course, you got to get approval from the head pastor, church leadership, and all that. That's a must. And then even leveraging and participating in existing offerings like health fairs and info sessions, demonstrating and gaining buy-in from the membership, providing mental health trainings at various levels across the church, actually joining the church, and not just for the performativeness of it all, but only if so moved. And then considering that assertion that we talked about earlier, that pastors are frequently the first line of defense, it's critical that these pastors proactively seek to increase their knowledge and understanding of mental health, mental illness, and mental wellness. And they can do this by participating in trainings, conferences, advisory boards, other agencies and networks that they can then leverage for referrals and to identify potential expertise and talent that might join the church's care team. I also did find a church in Harlem that built a free mental health clinic, and a 2022 Journal of Psychiatric Services study on the perspectives of members of the Black community who receive services from that clinic found that the key elements to making that initiative successful included the services being free. That was number one, but also that they were provided under this umbrella of a trusted institution, and that there was intentional effort to integrate faith perspectives and experiences with the therapeutic care. So ultimately, there was several other examples, but it just shows that these collaborations and successful ones are possible, but it has to be part of a multifaceted approach that considers these best practices and also shifts narratives around this is just the way things have always been done in the Black church, because that's not always the way.
Thank you, Dr. Arielle Kelly, and thank you to all of you, our panelists, for breaking this down. It's mental health seeps into every part of our lives, our finances, how we parent, how we are in relationships. So I really do hope that everyone viewing this and that will view the recording, that this was helpful. I personally have a couple of family members, one who's struggling with 20s in lifing, and she's unfortunately in a place where she thinks every bad thing or unfavorable thing that happens to her is because God is upset with her. And that kind of thinking really does put a strain on our relationship with religion, because who wants to feel like they're worshiping a vengeful God? So I really do hope that this is something that can strengthen everyone's mental health, and if they do worship God, their relationship with God. I do want to also go ahead and open up the questions to the group, a Q&A session. I saw the chat was going crazy, so we really appreciate your interactiveness and your attentiveness to this discussion. So I'm just going to go through and start with what I've seen, and then you can also add in the chat and I'll read them out. Okay. Yes, the recording will be available to the public. And do you all want to touch on the faith it till you make it and the fake it till you make it sayings that are now going in with the too blessed to be stressed? You want to touch on that a little bit?
I can touch on that a little bit. I think, those sayings, fake it till you make it, let's lay it on the altar. As we talked about earlier, what happens in this house stays in this house. I think a part of it was initially supposed to be like a protection for us, right? So if outsiders don't know what's going on, then we are free from judgment. We are protected. Our family members won't be, taken from our homes under the cover of darkness. So I think that, again, as a legacy of slavery, these things were intentionally well intended to be protective factors for us. But as Dr. Ely Kelly alluded to in her presentation, that these things just became a cover up for our individual mental health needs. And we've kind of tricked ourselves into believing if we just do those things, right? If we just continue to fake it when we make it, when we show up in spite of, when we work past our burnout, then there will be a reward for us, right? So there's either an earthly reward of greater finance and accolades, or there's a heavenly reward for, all of our works here. And the reality of the matter is that those things ultimately just do us a disservice, because it prevents us from getting the care that we need. And so I want to be the first to encourage anyone here today that you don't have to fake it until you make it, that needing help isn't a sign of weakness. And we encourage you to, just in having this conversation or being a part of this conversation today, to think about what that looks like for you as an individual, and then to take this conversation a step further, to have conversations with those in the spaces that you do occupy, to think more about what some next steps for mental health support could look like for you and in those spaces.
Thank you. Okay, and the next question. How does the superwoman syndrome differ from the John Henryism syndrome? I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. I did just have to do a quick Google, so I can go ahead and read the definition of that if you like. Yes, okay. So the John Henryism hypothesis posits that individuals who actively cope with psychosocial stressors in the face of low socioeconomic resources are more likely to exhibit higher blood pressure levels than those with greater socioeconomic resources. Oh, I haven't heard that, but thank you for sharing, Archie. I personally would think that one would lead to the other. Superwoman would then lead you to having John Henryism. Because, carrying all the stress for everybody, that's going to lead to high blood pressure.
I can add to that too, and say that, so superwoman syndrome specifically refers to a pressure experienced by women, specifically Black women, where they're being forced to not just show up, but excel in areas of their lives. So whether it's professionally, as a caretaker, in a personal relationship, the attempt that you have to present yourself as capable and on point at all times while handling a ton of pressure without showing anybody that you're stressed or even showing any signs of vulnerability. And also, I would say typically John Henryism is usually applied to Black men, though I know recent research and studies have been used to use it across the population, but typically it is used when discussing the challenges, the psychological challenges faced by Black men. Both of them are going to address the response to systemic issues, which we've already kind of alluded to in our conversation. But Superwoman Syndrome is going to emphasize the multidimensional expectations placed on Black women. So again, I can't just be great at work, but I got to be great at home. I got to be great in marriage. I got to be great with my mom. I got to be great at the grocery store. Like at all times, people need to see me doing well. Whereas John Henryism is going to focus more on the effort to achieve success and overcome barriers through hard work.
Thank you. Thank you for breaking that down.
If I could just follow up too, Arielle, everything Dr. Diaz said is spot on. And I would just add that both of them feed into this idea that we can work ourselves out of systemic oppression and, you know, structural racism and all the barriers that we've already discussed. But they both kind of feed into that concept that if I just do a little bit more. And instead, what we're really doing in a lot of cases is working ourselves toward an early grave, you know, so.
And I do want to add to that while both of those theories are looking at, you know, two separate things, let us not ignore the connection, because whether I am a woman who feels pressure to show up well and excel at all things, or I am a Black man or woman who is trying to show up with all the coping mechanisms, working really hard to not feel the pressures of systemic racism and oppression. Ultimately, there is a physiological health impact for showing up in that way. And when we look at just from a health perspective, women, Black women, and heart disease, heart failure, heart attacks, and the impact, the way stress changes our body. We have to just stop and ask ourselves, is it really worth it to live up to this pressure? And so I would hope that in asking that question and answering it for ourselves, that we find that ultimately it is not, because as Dr. Ely Kelly says, it leads us to an early grave, you know, just the maintenance of that pressure and the impact that it has on our bodies.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Jawan Johnson. Numerous studies indicate a sharp decline in Black church attendance since COVID-19. If the Black church is abandoned, what institution do African Americans have for collective support? Question number one. And then how do we transform these spaces to meet contemporary concerns related to mental and emotional health? I can reread the first question for you all. If the Black church is abandoned, what institution do African Americans have for collective support?
Well, I would say my initial thoughts are that this takes us back to the initial conversation that Dr. Lee and I were having about this turn to social media for collective support. And I'll just also offer that I didn't grow up in the Black church. And so for me, I never really had that significant tie to that is my only source of support. It really came from the conversations that I'm having with other Black women and just other opportunities for connection that I was able to build, whether it be through my, my small, doctoral program cohort and the only other, Black woman in that cohort, or just different programs, leadership programs that I've, ventured into. And then there's one or two other people that we've connected, and we've been able to kind of develop these support systems, whether we're in the same place or not. So again, technology plays a huge role in this, being able to connect across, the nation. So just a very cursory response for me, and I think for other people, the Black church wasn't necessarily always the end all be all. And I think now we see more and more that that's not the case, and social media is kind of the impetus and kickoff for developing these really, really meaningful conversations that are happening. I know people are saying put the microphones down but these podcasts that are cropping up, or even just us having this conversation today, and we've already talked about all the different offshoots and follow-up that we can do. So that would be what I have to offer on that.
I would even say I grew up in the Black church, but it wasn't the core of where I had my friends and where I had my community. And I've noticed now that as I've gotten older, a lot of us who move around at the transplants at different places, we are looking for our tribe in just day-to-day things and things that we do, whether it's we're going to like work out or our jobs. I work in media and am very few Black people, and we called ourselves like the Black Secondé, and we just stuck together. And few of us have left that job and we're still friends, and we still look to each other as still in the media. We're not, even outside that company, we're not really accurately represented. So we still look out for each other with jobs. And I think common interests, book clubs, me and all the panelists are in the same sorority. So those type of groups and things that really are the core, because just because you go to church with somebody doesn't mean you all have the same values and interests. So it is really good to look at those interests outside of religion and see where you can form your people or your tribe. And if no one else wants to add to that, I do have another question. Okay. This comes from Reverend Rachel Paris. Are you aware of any seminaries that are actively working to equip young ministers with the mental health resources that are needed to lead congregations as they begin their work as ministers?
I'll just share, Reverend Pierce. I don't know of any specific seminaries that are doing that, but, shout out again to Alfred Street Baptist Church, Reverend Howard John Wesley. And I say that because on his, I believe, 50th birthday, in lieu of some other, celebration types, he decided to host this, I don't know what he called it, but he brought together 50 young budding individuals in ministry, and was imparting to them a lot of different, strategies and things like that, but there definitely was a focus on that mental health component. And so I think that, that is a start and something that I think he intends to grow. So that's something that I think definitely can be replicated. But yeah, and we've talked at length again about how can we continue this conversation? What are some offshoots in different areas we can go into for future research? And so I definitely think that's something that we can follow up on.
I can also add to this, and I'm not sure to the extent of what they offer kind of internally, but I'll say even just as recent as February, the Virginia Theological Seminary hosted an Understanding Suicide and Mental Health 4-part course on Zoom for people to attend, specifically with the mission of saying that as people of faith, we have to give hope to people that are hurting, and there's a way to do this with a Christ-centered and clinically appropriate approach. And so they offered that for people to register virtually and attend and get that support. And then I know also the Calvin Theological Seminary last year just launched a Master of Arts in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. And they launched it specifically, they said, in response to the growing rates of suicide and mental health needs, and just feeling like they wanted to have a program offering where people could get a Christ-centered education rooted in, of course, biblical principles, but helping people that need it the most. So those are two educational spaces that come up.
Thank you. There also have been some answers and resources dropped in the chat. If anyone would like to save the chat, you can hit the first 3 dots or the 3 dots above where you would type in and hit save chat, and that usually auto-populates once we hang up. So you can have those resources, including the books that Dr. Ely Kelly mentioned earlier in the discussion. Okay, and now we have a question from Ms. Anita Rao. Hope I'm saying that correctly. I'm a psychiatrist at Northwestern, working in the southwest side of Chicago. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations of how the psychiatric community can acknowledge and address structural racism and racist practices propagated by the field of psychiatry to rebuild trust working alongside faith communities? Well, that's a nice heavy question. Does anyone want to tackle that one?
So I'll tackle it, and I want to say first, Anita, thank you so much for that question. I want to be clear that I don't think that there is one single easy answer to that question. I would just say that it starts just with the thought, the fact that it is a question that you even, have to give consideration to, I think is an important first step. And so I would encourage you or others that you are in the practice with to think about what this looks like in your space, and then what makes sense given the resources that you have available to you and the steps that you are willing and able to take right now in this moment. Because definitely, there is an alignment. There should be an alignment, but I think what happens is that we just don't have the conversation. We don't consider it. And so that in and of itself becomes a barrier to success.
I can also add to what Dr. Lee shared. So the first thing that I would always say is that, to echo what she said, you've started with acknowledging. And I always say that's the first step, because I don't think you can actually move forward until you acknowledge, okay, there is an issue. We are facing, systemic issues. There is structural racism here. Say it, own it, and ensure that you let people know that it exists. And then from there, I always say, create a plan for continuous education. So I've done a lot of, for years, I've trained and created corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings on everything from implicit bias to recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce, building a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan. And in all of that, I tell everybody, like, just because, our engagement ends, just because the training stopped, it doesn't mean that y'all get a gold star and you get to go home. It means that we've now started this journey, and you have to be committed to continuously learning. So always, whether it's you, whether it's your colleagues, how is there space for you to continue to grow and add to your skill set in being culturally competent and aware and serving your population? I'll also say that organizations that I've just seen do this well know that the work cannot be done in isolation. There is power in collaboration and community. So even if you don't have the answer, who in your community, in your space, can partner with you? So my husband, he works in the nonprofit space that specifically works with children, but his organization is partnered with the school system, partnered with the local mentoring organization. They're partnered with a local sports agency, because they know they can't be the financial, healthcare, sports, tutoring, like they can't be it all. And so understanding that, yes, we may focus on psychiatric support, but maybe somebody needs a doctor. So how is our partnership with the local hospital or a local doctor's office? Maybe somebody needs food. Do we partner with the food pantry? So I would also encourage you to think about what your immediate needs are, and don't so much focus on the we have to do it, but we can also be a pathway to another resource in the community as well.
I love that. I would also love to add the understanding that as Black people, we are wary and our senses are heightened when it does come to things of mental and psychiatric care, because we have been used as mules and as test dummies for so much. So jumping in with something like, someone may need a medication, don't jump in with that, because already it's going to be like, oh, they're trying to just medicate me up so I can be walking around like a zombie. So just really tread lightly, and also be understanding that there is going to be a lot of hesitation, even for the people that do want help. They're just trying to think of the best way to get that help. So really, and be consistent. If they deny it one time, still work with them. They'll come around, we hope. Next question. Oh, following up on that question, Dr. Diaz, Anita would like to know, do you mind mentioning your husband's organization?
Yes, so his organization is called City of Promise, based in Charlottesville, Virginia. They were founded in a low-income housing community support. They call it from the crib to the college experience. So babies all the way up to grown students who are kind of 2 years post high school.
Thank you. And we just have a comment from Sherelle Bland in regards to the unlimited PTO. She agrees, they agree. As a Black person, we try to be a strong person, even when we're experiencing problems of our own. We're so used to having to be strong that it's difficult to take that hat off and take care of ourselves. I know the struggle with trying to do it all and not take care of myself. Thank you for sharing, Sherelle. And the next question is from Leona Brown. How does menopause spill into this?
Anybody want to tackle this one? No. Okay, so I think menopause spills into this in a way that it is something that, much like mental health in the Black community, for Black women, we don't talk about. I feel like it is a recent phenomenon that women are deciding to be more vocal. They are being loud about changes that are happening to their body, as opposed to being shamed for the changes and embarrassed by the changes that are happening to our body. And I think that when you go back, again, a legacy of slavery. We don't have time to be weak. Something is wrong with us. We're going to tuck that away and keep it pushing and continue to bear the burden and just carry the weight on our shoulders. And so even our physical ailments don't get our attention, and natural changes that are occurring with our body are not discussed. As if something is wrong with them. And that's whether you're talking about, just our menstrual cycles, whether you're talking about Black women in childbirth, and then take it, a step further to menopause. These are things that don't get attention. These are things that when we highlight our concerns or our questions, as Dr. Ely Kelly said earlier, we are, as Black women, not taken seriously in the medical field. We don't hurt the same way. We don't experience the same way. I just feel like, again, there's a deeper connection. So I think that there is more to come. I think that there is so much that we can learn about Black women and menopause and the connection to our historical experiences. I think, I don't know if anybody follows Instagram personality Tabitha Brown, but she has, recently come out and started being very forthright with her experiences with menopause. And I have to be honest, as a Black woman who has not entered that phase of her life yet, I feel like I am getting so much information just from Tabitha Brown being willing to share her personal experiences. And so I think that that is important, not only for that topic, but any of our things that impact us as Black men and women, as we just really do the work to unlearn some traditional models and methods and ways of living. As you heard earlier, the way we've always done it is not necessarily the best way for it to be done. So I hope that this conversation around menopause and so many other things continues to be a conversation, because I feel that it too is timely.
The topic of menstruation and menopause and perimenopause now is becoming less taboo. I've recently listened to a podcast episode or two, it was a two-parter. The podcast is Getting Grown, and they had a doctor, a gynecologist specifically on her social media platform is like Dr. Every Woman. And she was talking about how menopause really, and just having a period, really does affect the body. And I think just even having the conversation now, like you can be more vocal about the mood shifts. And so you just don't look like mean, angry, mad. And you just feel like, I'm going through it right now. I had a little hot flash that has me feeling uncomfortable in my body. And so I think just having that conversation now, everyone doesn't want to hear it, but it is a reality that we can just say, like, this is affecting my mood and my mental health, because once hormones fluctuate, it really does take a toll on the mental. So thank you, Leona, for that question. Next, from Calvin Cutler, aside from the presenters' backgrounds, what are the future trends of this project? And Calvin, if you don't mind putting in the chat, do you mean as far as like this particular study or of the Lemon project? This study in the project is what Calvin said.
So we'll have to leave for the Lemon project. We'll allow the women married representatives to respond to that. But for this study, I can't speak for Dr. Lee, who was the driving force for this in the very beginning. But one of the first things that she said to me when she contacted me about this was, we're going to be at Essence. That was one of the first things that she said. And I was like, yes, sis, speak it. Okay, we're going to be on that stage. And I was like, let's bring some of our line sisters with us. Okay. So, but seriously, the biggest thing for us, I believe, is continuing the conversation. We talked about some different avenues or offshoot topics that we can go into. But as follow-up to what I was saying earlier, when you talk about building community, it starts with just the conversation. It starts with what Tab is doing on Instagram. And so for me, on a small scale, I just want to see us taking the feedback that y'all have given us today and also diving deeper into the data that we collected from that study, looking at even more churches and seminaries and other programs that are doing the work and figuring out, is there a model that we can develop, or, just what are the next steps? And we talked a lot in preparing for this panel about, what's the solution? And we ultimately were like, there is no one solution, but we want to be driving some of the conversation toward what that can look like. So.
Thank you. And I know we may be running low on time, so I do want to just say one more question that came from someone who hasn't asked already. From Patricia Hilliard, any ideas or suggestions as how to break the secrecy and silence barrier in our individual families that continues to burden or weigh on the younger generations of families? I personally think keeping an open door and showing the example of talking. I was the first of my cousins, or my cluster of cousins, there's quite a few of us, who openly talks about going to therapy and needing to, the family generational curse that had been happening. And now I have younger cousins who are going to therapy, even older cousins that are going to therapy and openly talking about it. So I think being an example of being an open book is a great way to break that secrecy, and also with children. That's the best way to let them know, like, there's some things that you do need to share.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the more things are made a norm, and obviously they can't become normal until somebody steps up and does it and models it. But the more that things become normal within your space or within your organization or your home, the more that people will then kind of begin to shift away from the idea that I got to keep it all in and I can't say anything. I think about most of the times where I have felt my least vulnerable, or like I just had to keep pushing through, and it was in spaces where I was told, you can't let them see you cry, you can't let them see you show emotion, you got to go in there like you know everything, you have to go in there like you're not going to make any mistakes, you have to just show up like you have all the answers, when I knew deep down I didn't, and I was feeling really overwhelmed and just needed some help. And then I also just think about, in general, in spaces where I feel the most safe are spaces where I know it's okay for me not to have it together. And specifically, it's spaces where I can make mistakes. Obviously, I talked a lot today about professional environments, but I tell a lot of people, like, do people genuinely feel like they have to be perfect? Or do they feel like it is absolutely normal to be a mess sometimes? Like that they cannot have, that if you come in here and you don't have it all together, then you're absolutely fine. Or do they feel like the standard is you have to have it all together, you have to show up on point, and if you don't, then we're judging you for it. So I also think too, like, pushing away from the standard of perfection and reminding people that it's impossible to be perfect, and really just accepting people for the best they can give you, not even on a yearly or monthly basis, but like today, and sometimes the hour. Like, how are you showing up in this very conversation at your best? And you're giving me your best, and I'm good with that.
I often think about sometimes my white counterparts and coworkers, how they show that they're flustered, they're overwhelmed, and sometimes cry. And I'm like, I wish I could do that. I wish I could say this is too much. But
and newsflash, I always say, acting like you have it all together does not make people stop pressuring you. In fact, it makes them do it more. So in every space where I've shown up overwhelmed, but kept it in and been like, I can do it. It's fine. I got it all together. I'm great. Like, I'm good. Literally, it just led to like 30 more responsibilities that I didn't even want. Whereas my colleague who like cried at the staff meeting,
they were
like, well, right, they're off. It was like, why don't you take a day off? Go spend time with your family. You are so overwhelmed. We just want you to be comfortable. But Tamara can do it. Tamara, you're fine. Like, you can take that project off her plate. And I'm just sitting here thinking, like, Well, I was crying too, but I just didn't
Yeah.
like, I held it in. I
Mhm.
just didn't say anything. And so I'm learning and I'm reminding myself that me faking that I have to be strong in moments of vulnerability doesn't even serve the other people around me, and it surely doesn't serve me.
Yeah. More work is usually the reward for competency.
Yep.
And if I could just take it back to the family piece of it, you know, this is not to say that when you start doing that, when you start talking about it, that it's going to be received well, or that, that they're going to be making it like, something's wrong with you. But you just have to keep showing up. You just have to keep talking about it. And what I know for me, I found with my mom in particular is when she sees me responding differently to certain stuff that previously may have been a trigger, or it would have bothered me a whole lot more or whatever. I can see the surprise in her, and sometimes she'll comment on it. And it's important to, as they say, name or call out that, yeah, that's because of that therapy. Okay. That's because I've been talking to somebody. And so I just think continuing to show up how you show up differently and better, and trying to be better and respond differently to different situations, and being real and honest about what's helping you be able to do that. And saying, and I'm just speaking for myself, that it's not just me praying about the thing. Yes, I've been praying about it, but I also have been going to therapy. I've also been doing these other self-help and self-care things. Just opening that conversation. It can be kind of awkward, but I think we've made progress, and that's because I just keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. I know we have hit the time limit, so I want to thank everyone for participating and joining us. And I really hope that you were able to take something away from this, and that you will follow us to see what we have coming next, and as well as William and Mary's Lemon Project. Thank you for having us. Thank you for having this discussion and all of your discussions. And we really do appreciate you giving us a platform to have this. So I will turn it back over to Sarah from William and Mary.
This was a really great conversation, and thank you all for all your conversation and your thoughts. This was very important. We'll be putting this up on our YouTube channel. I placed in the chat some links for our upcoming events, and mark your calendars for next year's symposium, which will be our 15th annual spring symposium. It's March 21st through March 22nd, 2025. So we hope that y'all can all join us for that next March. But thank you all very much, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.